All right, so, you know, how many times a day do you think you really connect with someone? Like, really talk?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're always communicating, right? Texting, emailing, posting. But is it actually talking?
Right. Yeah. That's what we're diving into today. Sherry Turkle's book, Reclaiming Conversation, really got me thinking about how much we talk, but how little we might actually be connecting.
It's like we're all so busy communicating, but, are we actually saying anything?
It's like a silent spring, but for conversation.
Ooh, that's good. Like Rachel Carson, but for talking.
Exactly. So Sherry Turkle, she starts off with this idea of an empathy gap.
Empathy gap.
Yeah, she was observing middle schoolers, and she noticed that the 12-year-olds, they weren't as good at, like, putting themselves in other people's shoes as the younger kids were.
Interesting. I mean, I feel like we hear so much about kids these days being glued to their phones.
Well, yeah, and that's part of it. But her point is, it's not just about what they're doing on their phones. It's about what they're not doing, like having those face-to-face conversations that actually teach you how to empathize.
Oh, I see. So it's not just the content, it's the actual act of talking that matters.
Right, those real open-ended conversations where you have to, like, read someone's face, listen to their tone, really try to understand where they're coming from.
Makes sense. I remember when I was a kid, we'd spend hours just talking with friends. No phones, no distractions.
Exactly. And Sherry Turkle, she worries that we're losing that ability, trading depth for breadth. We've got tons of connections, but they're all kind of surface level.
I feel like I can relate to that. Like, I've got hundreds of Facebook friends, but how many of them do I really know?
Right. It's like Sherry Turkle says, they know each other, but not well.
Oof, that hits home. So what's the solution? Do we all need to ditch our phones and go live in a cabin in the woods?
Well, Sherry Turkle actually talks about an unplugged cabin retreat.
Wait, really?
Yeah, some middle school teachers organized it. No phones, no internet, just nature and conversation.
I bet the kids hated it.
Actually, no. They were surprised by how much they enjoyed it. Like, they started to appreciate those quiet moments, just observing things, letting their minds wander.
Wow. I guess we can all learn something from that.
Absolutely. And Sherry Turkle, she's not anti-technology, She acknowledges the benefits, like staying in touch with family, reconnecting with old friends. Like, she talks about her daughter sending her these little texts throughout the day, just kind of like, hey, thinking of you kind of things.
Yeah, that's sweet. Yeah, those little digital check-ins can be nice.
Right. But the question is, at what point do those little snippets of connection start to replace real, deeper conversations?
Yeah, that's the balance, isn't it? Like, when does the convenience of digital communication start to actually get in the way of genuine connection?
She talks about families sitting together at dinner, everyone on their phones. Like, they're physically together, but they're not really there.
Oh, I see that all the time. It's like we're so drawn to our devices, even when the people we care about are right there in front of us.
In Sherry Turkle, she points out this weird thing. People with phones present are less vulnerable, but they're also more distant. It's like we're hiding behind our screens.
Huh. That's interesting. I wonder if it's because, we know we can always escape back into our phones if the conversation gets uncomfortable.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And she really emphasizes how important conversation is, not just for connecting with other people, but for understanding ourselves. Like, you have to talk things out to really figure out what you think and feel.
That makes sense. Like, when you're trying to explain something to someone else, you have to really think it through, clarify your own thoughts.
Right. And she worries about kids who are growing up without that kind of conversational interaction. Like, their caregivers are constantly distracted on their phones, not really engaging with them.
That's sad. It's like they're missing out on those crucial moments of connection that help them learn how to relate to other people.
Exactly. And she points out that the ability to have a conversation is directly linked to empathy. Like, being able to listen to someone, understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah, that's a real skill, and one that seems to be getting lost in this, instant gratification digital world.
And speaking of instant gratification, this leads us to what Sherry Turkle calls the trouble with text.
Oh, here we go. I feel like I know where this is going.
She talks about this idea of continuous partial attention. Like, we're constantly scanning, checking, responding, but we're never really fully present in any one moment.
Yeah, I feel that. It's like my brain is always buzzing with all these different inputs. It's hard to just focus on one thing.
And this constant connectivity, it creates this expectation of immediate responses, which can actually be really detrimental to conversation.
How so?
Well, think about it. When you're texting, you feel this pressure to reply right away. There's no time to pause. to really consider what you want to say.
Oh, yeah, I hate that feeling. Like, I'm always worried about seeming rude if I don't respond immediately.
Exactly. And it can lead to these superficial exchanges where you're just bouncing back and forth, not really getting into anything deep or meaningful.
And what about those text apologies? The sorry followed by a sad face emoji.
Sherry Turkle calls that the artificial truce. Like, it's quick, it's easy, but it doesn't really carry the same weight as a face-to-face apology.
Yeah, it lacks that sincerity, that like emotional resonance.
Right. She tells the story about a mom who made her son call his grandparents to cancel plans instead of just texting them
Oh, interesting. Why?
because she wanted him to hear the disappointment in their voices, to really understand the impact of his decision. It was a way to make the consequences more real, more tangible.
That's smart. It's like a text can feel so detached, so impersonal.
And she also points out how texting allows for this constant editing and curation. Like, you can craft the perfect message before you hit send. There's no room for those awkward pauses, those stumbles that happen in real-time conversation.
Which can be a good thing sometimes, right? I mean, I've definitely avoided some arguments by taking the time to think before I text.
Sure, but it also kind of removes the risk, the spontaneity that can lead to those really insightful moments.
Yeah. It's like you're always presenting this polished, perfect version of yourself.
And she brings up this idea from Heinrich von Kleist, this idea that thoughts gradually shape themselves while speaking. Like, we often don't even know what we really think until we start talking it out.
Oh, that's so true. It's like the act of speaking helps to clarify your own thoughts.
Right. And she even compares it to that French proverb, appetite comes with eating. Like, you might not think you're hungry, but once you start eating, you realize you were starving. It's the same with conversation.
I like that analogy. So we need to kind of jumpstart the conversation to see where it takes us.
Exactly. And Sherry Turkle, she also talks about how even sharing photos can be a form of controlled distance. Like, you choose the perfect shot, crop it, filter it, present this curated image of your life.
So it's not just about the words we use. It's about the entire presentation, the image we're projecting online.
Right. And she suggests that this idea of being comfortable, it's shifted. Like, for a lot of people, comfort isn't about feeling relaxed and connected with the people around them. It's about having their phone nearby, knowing they can escape back into that digital world if they need to.
It's like we're outsourcing our sense of belonging to our devices.
Exactly. And this brings us to her exploration of friendships online, this idea of the contingent self.
Contingent self, what's that?
It's basically the idea that we present different versions of ourselves online depending on who we're talking to. Like, we're constantly tailoring our image to fit the audience.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, my Instagram persona is definitely different from how I am in real life.
Right. And she talks about how online platforms make it so easy to maintain all these superficial connections. Like, you have hundreds of friends, but how many of them do you really have deep, meaningful conversations with?
Yeah, it's like we're all so busy collecting friends that we forget to actually nurture those friendships.
And it's interesting, she observed something in an Apple store, of all places.
An Apple store, what happened?
She noticed that the younger people, they weren't as captivated by the devices as the older generations were.
That's curious. Maybe they're just used to it, Like it's not as novel or exciting for them.
Maybe. But it also suggests that their relationship with technology is different. Like, they've grown up with it always being there, so it's not this, like, shiny new toy.
And she talks about this teenage boy who found it really hard to have conversations at school, but was totally fine at summer camp when he didn't have his phone.
Yeah, and he realized that back home, most of his conversations with friends were about stuff they saw on their phones. But at camp, they actually talked about their own thoughts and feelings.
That's a powerful realization. It's like the technology itself was shaping the content of their conversations.
And Sherry Turkle quotes Luciano Pavarotti, who said that the most magical thing is when someone is so present with you that they don't even think to check their phone.
Oh, I love that. It's like you're the center of their attention, even more important than whatever's happening in their digital world.
Right. And Alain de Botton, he defines true love as not wanting to glance at your phone when you're with the other person.
Wow, that's a high bar. But I get it, It's about that feeling of being truly seen, truly heard.
And yet we have this expectation that everyone should be reachable, responsive, all the time.
Yeah, it's like we're always on call, even in our personal lives.
And Sherry Turkle contrasts this with the leaving space strategy that's often used in early romance, like
Yeah.
deliberately not replying right away to build a little mystery, a little anticipation.
Oh, the game playing. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
definitely been on both sides of that.
And she points out how this constant contact can actually be detrimental to developing resilience in relationships. Like, we're so used to having all the answers at our fingertips that we forget how to deal with uncertainty, which is a natural part of any relationship.
It's like we need a little bit of space, a little bit of mystery to keep things interesting.
And then, of course, there's the whole world of online dating.
Oh, yeah, that can be a whole other beast.
Sherry Turkle quotes someone who calls it in-your-face marketing. Like, you're the product, and you're constantly trying to sell yourself through your profile.
It's true. It's all about presenting this like idealized version of yourself.
And she talks about the paradox of choice. Like, having so many options can actually make it harder to choose.
Oh, totally. I get decision fatigue just browsing through dating apps.
Right. And she references the psychologists, Myers and Lane, who say that all this choice can actually lead to depression and loneliness. Like, we're constantly comparing ourselves to all these other people, all these
Yeah.
potential partners, and it can make us feel inadequate.
It's like the more options we have, the less satisfied we are with what we actually have.
And she tells this story about Adam and Tessa, a couple who broke up mostly through texts and emails.
Oh, wow. That's rough.
Yeah. And afterward, Adam realized that all those carefully crafted messages might not have reflected Tessa's true feelings.
Yeah.
Like, how can you really know someone when so much of your communication is filtered through a screen?
That's a good question. And it makes me wonder, like, how much of ourselves are we really revealing online?
Right. And this whole issue of distraction, it's not just in our personal lives, it's also affecting education.
No, yeah, I've definitely seen that. Like students trying to text under their desks during class.
Sherry Turkle shares this anecdote about an MIT student who said they needed to text in class because they had to know who was trying to reach them.
Like it couldn't wait.
Apparently not. And then there's the whole multitasking thing. Like, students are constantly on their laptops, checking social media, shopping, whatever, even during lectures.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. It's hard to resist, right? But it definitely affects their ability to learn.
And she tells this story about a high school where they gave all the students smartphones.
Oh, no. What happened?
They started texting constantly in class. Like, it was so bad that they had to implement a no texting in class policy,
Bruh.
but it was totally ineffective,
So the temptation was just too strong.
basically.
Bruh.
And one student even admitted that they were texting mostly out of boredom. Like, they knew the lecture content was online, so they didn't feel like they needed to pay attention.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? If you believe you don't need to pay attention, then you won't.
Exactly. And this was back in 2008 when Oliver predicted that students would be using their laptops for everything but taking notes.
And he was right.
Totally. And then there's Lena, who got an iPad for all her 8th grade coursework, but found it too distracting.
I can relate to that. Sometimes I feel like I actually focus better when I'm reading a physical book.
Yeah, and Lena realized that the iPad was designed to pull her in all these different directions.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about willpower, it's about the way the technology itself is designed.
So what's the solution? Do we ban all technology from schools?
Well, Sherry Turkle presents a couple of different perspectives. Catherine Hales argues that we should embrace hyperattention and distributed cognition, like adapt our teaching methods to accommodate students' multitasking habits.
So instead of fighting it, we should try to work with it.
Exactly. Like, she talks about Google jockeying and back-channeling as ways to incorporate technology more effectively into the classroom.
Interesting. So like using technology to enhance learning rather than distracting from it.
Right. But then there's the counter-argument, which is that we need to preserve those moments of boredom. Like, those seemingly unproductive times can actually be really important for creativity and imagination.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like when you have nothing to do, your mind starts to wander and you come up with new ideas.
And then there's the rise of MOOCs,
NEMOC.
massive open online courses.
Oh, right.
And they're kind of a mixed bag. Like, they offer flexibility and accessibility, but they also cater to these shorter attention spans.
Yeah, it's hard to stay engaged for a long lecture when you're watching it on a computer screen.
And then there's the flipped classroom model, where students watch lectures online and then come to class for discussion and activities.
So it's like a blend of online and in-person learning.
Right. And Sherry Turkle brings up Seymour Papert's idea that you can't think without something to think with. Like, we need tools to help us process information and make connections.
And she suggests that MOOCs can be those tools, even if they have their limitations.
Exactly. Like, she shares an example of a Harvard MOOC where students were sharing recordings of themselves reading Homer in their own languages.
Wow, that's cool. Like using technology to create a global conversation about classic literature.
And then she talks about this debate at MIT about using anonymous clickers in class.
Clickers.
Like those little devices where students can answer multiple choice questions during a lecture.
Oh,
And some professors loved them because it gave them immediate feedback on student understanding.
yeah, I can see how that would be useful.
But others worried that it was reinforcing students' dependence on anonymity. Like they weren't comfortable expressing their opinions publicly, even if they were wrong.
That's an interesting point. Like, are we losing the ability to have those difficult conversations where we might disagree with each other?
And this brings us to the workplace.
Oh, boy. I feel like I know where this is going.
Sherry Turkle talks about these young lawyers who are basically isolated in their own little tech bubbles. Like they're constantly working on their computers, not interacting with each other.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that in my own workplace. It's like everyone's glued to their screens.
And she contrasts this with the old days when there was more mentorship, more informal interaction. Like people would just chat around the water cooler and bounce ideas off of each other.
Yeah, those spontaneous conversations can be so valuable. You never know where they might lead.
And now everything's scheduled, formalized. Like people are more comfortable communicating through email than actually talking to each other.
I wonder if it's because email feels less risky, you know? Like you have more time to think about what you want to say.
Maybe. But it also creates this distance. Like you're not building those personal connections.
And what about meetings? Are they just as bad?
Even worse. Sherry Turkle talks about stealth multitasking. Like people are pretending to pay attention, but they're actually checking email, browsing the web, whatever.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that. It's so easy to get distracted.
And she shares this anecdote about a meeting about technology's impact on communication, where everyone was constantly being interrupted by their phones.
Oh, the irony.
Right. And there's this consultant, Rattan, who noticed that her team's work was suffering because of all the multitasking. Like they weren't producing their best ideas.
So what does she do?
She started implementing some strategies to encourage more focused work. Like she would explicitly say that she wasn't using her computer during phone meetings.
So kind of leading by example.
Exactly. And she would divide her workday into online and offline periods.
That's a good idea, like setting boundaries to protect your time and attention.
And she encourages people to acknowledge their own susceptibility to distraction and then design their environment to minimize those distractions, like having designated device-free zones during meetings.
I like that. It's about taking control of your technology instead of letting it control you.
And then there's Victor Tripp, who went to an in-person team meeting and only 3 out of 15 people showed up.
Wow, that's sad.
It really shows how much we've shifted away from valuing physical presence.
And Sherry Turkle contrasts this with Harriet, who works in theater, where collaboration and face-to-face interaction are still so important.
Right, and Harriet laments how much has been lost with the shift to electronic communication. Like those spontaneous bursts of creativity that happen when you're all in the same room together.
Yeah, there's something magical about that energy, that shared inspiration.
And she talks about Tony Hammond's company, where they deliberately designed their office space to encourage interaction. Like putting offices on different floors so people have to walk past each other.
That's clever. It's like forcing those chance encounters that can lead to new ideas.
And then there's Vincent Castell, who redesigned his venture capital firm's office to prioritize conversation and community building.
And did it work?
He says it led to increased client interest and profits. Like people were more engaged, more creative.
Wow. So there's a real business case for fostering conversation.
But then there's Heart Technology, this software company that had all the right amenities, a stated commitment to communication, but people still weren't really talking to each other.
So what was the problem?
Sherry Turkle suggests that it's not enough to just create the space for conversation. You also need to create a culture that values and encourages it.
Like giving people permission to talk, to share their ideas, even if they're not fully formed.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final section of the book, where Sherry Turkle explores this idea of the public and private in the digital age.
Okay, what's she got to say about that?
Well, she starts by arguing that digital life encourages us to create this curated public self. Like we're
Yes.
constantly presenting this idealized version of ourselves online.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like we're all performing for our followers.
And this frictionless world of online interaction, it can lead to a kind of oversimplification of complex issues. Like we expect easy solutions, quick fixes, when real change often requires a lot more dialogue and nuance.
It's like we want to solve everything with a hashtag.
And she revisits her earlier metaphor of the computer screen as a second self, but now she talks about digital doppelgangers, like these algorithmic profiles that are created based on our online activity.
So it's like a shadow self that's constantly being tracked and analyzed.
And she uses the example of the Kony 2012 campaign.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And she points out how easy it was to participate online, to like share, donate, but that kind of engagement doesn't necessarily translate into real-world action.
It's like we feel like we're making a difference, but are we really?
And she contrasts this with the Greensboro sit-ins, where activists had these deep personal connections built through years of dialogue and shared experiences.
So it wasn't just about clicking a button. It was about putting yourself on the line, risking something real.
Exactly. And she talks about this shift towards a public self, where our data is constantly being collected and analyzed, often without our full awareness or consent.
Yeah, that's creepy. Like, who knows what they're doing with all that information?
And she quotes Mark Zuckerberg, who said that privacy is no longer a social norm.
Seriously, that's kind of scary.
It is. And she contrasts this with her own childhood, when her grandmother explained to her how the library protected the privacy of borrowing records. Like there was this understanding that intellectual freedom required privacy.
And now everything we do online is tracked and monitored.
But she also talks about how the younger generation is aware of this, and they're developing strategies to protect their privacy, like using pseudonyms, avoiding their real names.
So they're more tech savvy, but they're also more wary of the risks.
Right. And she points out that even trying to protect your privacy can sometimes make you more of a target.
That's messed up. Like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And then there's all the legal gray areas around online privacy, like what's legal to collect, how can it be used, who has access to it. It's all very murky.
And then there's this idea of digital gerrymandering.
What's that?
It's where algorithms are used to manipulate our online experiences to subtly influence our opinions and beliefs.
Oh, wow. Like we're being manipulated without even realizing it.
Exactly. And Sherry Turkle, she emphasizes the importance of protecting spaces for solitude, for reflection, for dissent. Like, we need those spaces to think for ourselves, to challenge the status quo.
So what's the takeaway here? Are we doomed to a future of shallow conversations and digital distraction?
Well, Sherry Turkle ends on a hopeful note. She quotes John Sawhill, who said, "Ultimately, it's not just what we create that defines us, it's what we choose not to destroy."
So we have a choice.
Right. We can choose to reclaim conversation, to prioritize real connection over digital distraction.
And she brings up Thoreau's idea of the 3 chairs.
3 chairs.
It's about the relationship between solitude, inner voice, and conversation. Like solitude allows us to develop our own thoughts and feelings, which we then bring to our conversations, both private and public. And those conversations then feed back into our solitude, enriching our inner lives.
It's a cycle.
Exactly. And Sherry Turkle argues that this cycle is being disrupted in the digital age. Like, we're losing our ability to be alone with our thoughts, and we're also losing our ability to have those deep, meaningful conversations.
But she also points out that this isn't a lost cause. Like, she talks about these kids who went to a tech-free summer camp and actually regained their empathy skills after just 5 days.
So it's not too late.
Right. We can relearn how to connect, how to listen, how to empathize.
And she talks about the app generation who have grown up with this engineered sensibility, this expectation of instant gratification and predictable outcomes.
Yeah, like they see the world through the lens of algorithms.
And this can lead to a lack of empathy, a lack of creativity, a kind of impatience with the messiness of real life.
So we need to teach them how to be more human, more present, more engaged with the world around them.
And she talks about the phenomenon of alone together. Like we're constantly surrounded by people, but we're not really connecting with them.
Yeah, we're all in our own little bubbles, staring at our screens.
And she emphasizes the importance of shared solitude, like intentionally choosing to disconnect from technology, even when you're with other people.
So like going for a walk together without your phones?
Or just sitting in silence, reading books, whatever. It's about creating space for those quiet moments of connection.
And even Thoreau struggled with distraction.
Right. Like he talks about how his mind would wander even when he was walking in the woods.
So it's a human thing, not just a technology thing.
Exactly. But the technology definitely amplifies it. And she ends by talking about this trend of people seeking companionship in AI assistants like Siri.
Really? Like people are actually forming relationships with their phones.
It sounds crazy, but
Yeah.
like there are people who see Siri as a confidant, a friend.
I guess it makes sense in a way. Like if you're feeling lonely and you don't have anyone to talk to, your phone is always there.
And she talks about these automated mental health apps that are being developed.
Oh, wow. Like therapy bots.
Basically. And it raises all these questions about the nature of empathy, the importance of the human connection in therapy.
Yeah. Can a machine really understand what it's like to be human?
It's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
And Sherry Turkle, she doesn't offer any easy answers, but she does leave us with a sense of hope. Like, we have the power to choose how we want to live, how we want to connect, how we want to use technology.
It's about finding that balance, right, between the digital world and the real world.
Exactly. And remembering that conversation, real face-to-face conversation, is still one of the most powerful and meaningful ways to connect with each other, to understand ourselves, and to create a more humane world.
So what's the one thing our listeners should take away from all of this?
I think it's this. The next time you're with someone you care about, put down your phone, look them in the eye, and really listen. You might be surprised by what you hear and by what you learn about yourself in the process.
Beautifully said. I think that's a great place to leave it.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.